Everyone knows the story. 300 Spartans, a narrow pass, a Persian army so vast it supposedly darkened the sun with its arrows. Leonidas and his men held for 3 days, died to the last, and saved Western civilization. Except that's not quite what happened. Not the 300 part. Not the saving civilization part. And definitely not the part where this was some glorious last stand that the Greeks saw coming and chose heroically. The real story of Thermopylae is stranger, more complicated and honestly more interesting than the version you know, because the version you know was written by the winners, and the winners had very specific reasons to tell it the way they did. Let's go back to 480 BC. Xerxes, king of Persia, has assembled what ancient sources describe as the largest army ever gathered in human history. Modern estimates put it somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men. The ancient sources said 2 million, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, but the point stands. This was an overwhelming force. His father Darius had already tried to conquer Greece 10 years earlier. That ended at Marathon, where a smaller Greek force crushed the Persian army in one of the most shocking upsets in military history. Xerxes was not going to make the same mistake. He was going in with everything. The Greeks knew this was coming. They had spies. They had time to prepare. And what they prepared was not enough. Here's the thing about the Greek city-states that never quite makes it into the popular version of this story. They hated each other. Sparta and Athens were rivals. Corinth didn't trust either of them. Half the northern Greek states faced with the approaching Persian army simply surrendered in advance. The technical term for this is medicing, collaborating with the Medes, which is what Greeks called the Persians. A significant portion of Greece had already decided that being part of the Persian Empire wasn't the worst outcome. So the force that assembled to hold the pass at Thermopylae was not a unified Greek army standing as one. It was a coalition of the willing, cobbled together under significant political pressure, and it was smaller than anyone wanted. The 300 Spartans are real, but they weren't alone. The total Greek force at Thermopylae was somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men. Spartans, yes, but also Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, Arcadians, and others. The Thespians in particular, and this almost never gets mentioned, fought to the last man alongside the Spartans. 700 Thespians died at Thermopylae. Their city had been threatened with destruction by Xerxes, and they refused to submit. They chose to fight knowing they would almost certainly die. Nobody makes films about the Thespians. Now, why Thermopylae? Why that particular pass? Geography. Thermopylae, the name means hot gates, named for the sulfur springs nearby, was one of the few places in Greece where a large army could be funneled into a narrow enough space that numbers stopped mattering. The pass at its narrowest point was roughly 15 meters wide. You can't deploy 100,000 men in 15 meters, you send them in columns and the Greeks cut them down. Leonidas understood this. He wasn't making a heroic last stand, he was buying time. The real battle of 480 BC wasn't Thermopylae. It was at sea, at Artemisium, where the Greek fleet was trying to hold the Persian navy. Thermopylae and Artemisium were being fought simultaneously, a land battle and a sea battle as part of the same defensive strategy. Hold the pass, hold the straits, bleed the Persians, slow them down. For 2 days it worked. The Persian army threw wave after wave at the Greek position and was cut apart. Xerxes reportedly sent his elite troops, the Immortals, on the second day. They fared no better. The pass was too narrow. Greek hoplite warfare in tight formation was devastatingly effective. Then someone betrayed them, a local man named Ephialtes, and his name has meant traitor in Greek ever since, went to Xerxes and told him about a mountain path that went around the pass. A path that would allow Persian troops to come at the Greeks from behind. Leonidas found out about this on the 3rd day. He had a choice: retreat with the whole army and live to fight another day, or stay. He sent most of the army away. The Thebans left. They'd been suspected of Persian sympathies anyway and probably weren't going to fight to the death. But the 300 Spartans stayed, and the 700 Thespians stayed, and about 1,000 others. Why did Leonidas stay? Script moment. The Persians burned Athens 6 months after Thermopylae. If the 300 were a victory, it was a very strange one. The legend was built on a defeat, and everyone involved knew it. /script moment. This is where it gets interesting. The Spartans had received an oracle from Delphi before the campaign. It said that either Sparta would be destroyed or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas almost certainly knew he was going to die at Thermopylae before he ever marched there. He chose the men who accompanied him specifically. 300 Spartans who all had living sons, so their family lines would continue. This wasn't a surprise last stand, it was a calculated sacrifice. And it worked, in the way that calculated sacrifices sometimes do. Not militarily.
I made the mistake of trusting Herodotus a bit too much when I said the Spartans knew about the flanking route before Leonidas made his final decision. The truth is messier. Herodotus says they knew about the Anopeia path from the beginning, but Ephialtes only betrayed its exact location on the second day of fighting. That timing matters because it suggests Leonidas wasn't planning a glorious last stand from day one. He was genuinely trying to hold the pass until he learned the Persians had found their way around. What really irritated me digging deeper into this was discovering how much the other Greeks and their contingents got screwed over in later retellings. The Thespians and Thebans, who stayed and died alongside the Spartans, basically vanished from popular memory. 700 Thespians chose to stay. That's their entire military-age male population. The city never recovered, but somehow we only remember the 300. I also undersold how quickly the legend got weaponized. I mentioned it was used for political purpose but later was actually immediate. Semiotides was writing his famous epitaph, "Go tell the Spartans." Within the months of the battle, this wasn't some organic folk tale that grew over centuries. It was deliberate propaganda from the start, crafted while Athens and Sparta were still technically allies. The detail that keeps nagging at me is that Xerxes apparently sat on the throne watching the final day unfold. Persian sources filtered through much later writings suggest he was genuinely impressed by the Spartan resistance. There's something almost absurd about a god king setting up lawn furniture to watch 300 men die rather than just walking around them. Here's what this matters beyond ancient history trivia. We're living through our own era of instant myth-making, where every event gets packaged into heroic narrative before the dust settles. The Thermopylae story shows how quickly military disasters become inspiration or even examples, and how the people who actually did the dying.
The film version, and that, honestly, is true of almost every story from ancient Greece.